Hello, everyone. Good evening or morning, wherever you are. It's my great pleasure and an honor to introduce Hava Tirosh-Samuelson. Dr. Samuelson is Director of Jewish Studies and Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism and Professor of History at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona. She writes on Jewish intellectual history with a focus on philosophy and mysticism in pre-modern Judaism, the interaction between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in the Middle Ages, on feminist philosophy, Judaism and ecology, bioethics, and religion and science. Through her interdisciplinary research, she seeks to create bridges between these intellectual disciplines and religious traditions, religious and secular outlooks, and also gendered perspectives. She's especially committed to understanding the complementary relationship between science and religion from an historical perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Samuelson.
Thank you, Dr. Salomon. I'm going to try to share my screen so we will all be able to follow the lecture, and let's see if it's working. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the organizer for putting it all together. As Dr. Solomon said already, I'm very much engaged in the conversation of science and religion, but I do so as an historian rather than as a scientist in a particular narrow definition of that word, or as a theologian. Even though I'm dealing with theology, I don't do it so much as a constructive theologian. The people that, obviously I'm not the only one who is doing this kind of a historical study of Judaism and science. There are other people. I have for you a few books that if you're not familiar with, I highly recommend that you do become familiar with it. And I'll come back to those books as I go through the notes, but you know, these are mostly historical overviews of the issue, but here in this book by Norbert Samuelson, Jewish Faith and Modern Science, you have actually the connection between science and religion and Jewish philosophy. And that's a point that I will mention also through the talk, especially when we get to the end. So what are my major arguments? My major argument is that we have a kind of a conundrum here. On the one hand, when you look at the conversation at the field of science and religion, Judaism is very marginal there. And it's very marginal if you look at Zygon, that you are going to find a major venue for science and religion. You're going to find very few essays mentioned. Among the projects that are, funded by Templeton Foundation, there are Jewish projects, but not very many. And among international societies, you'll find very few Jews involved in this conversation. So that's kind of interesting or even baffling because, and that's the argument of the talk, throughout its long history, actually, Jews were very, very engaged in the conversation about the relationship between Judaism and science. So here is kind of a summary of the talk. So my point is that science-engaged theology in Judaism has always functioned as a mediator between Judaism and surrounding cultures. You can also talk surrounding civilizations. However, we cannot really talk about one science-engaged Jewish theology. We need to talk about plurality of positions. And because we're going to talk about plurality of positions, the only way to do it is to do it as intellectual history. And I really believe that that's the best way of approaching the issue as intellectual history that covers changes over time. Those changes usually reflect the conditions of the Jewish minority in a given period, internal diversity within the Jewish society, and shifts in conceptions of science. So those are the three major factors that would impact the constant changes in what is Judaism, what is science engaged Jewish theology. I also suggest that we always have debates about those problems, because the problems pertain to education, because it's all about Jewish education, and education is about identity. You're not going to have consensus about Jewish, what is science-engaged Jewish theology, or what is Jewish theology for that matter. And I end up, the point here, the bottom of the screen on the right is basically, I'm not going to argue, I'm not going to develop it, I'm not going to prove it, but it seems to me that we really do need science-engaged theology for the future of Judaism. And without that kind of engagement, Judaism is going to be less believable, less tenable, and therefore less sustainable. So those are some of the things that I would like to leave you with. The structure is very straightforward. I'll start with some ambiguity of terms, especially the term science, which we're not going to agree on because it always has been used in various ways. Second part is the history, kind of, it's in very large brush strokes. I will try to tell you the story of that kind of conversation. And in the third part, I will look primarily at Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. I look at him as an example of contemporary science-engaged theology. You can also look at him. I definitely believe that he offers a certain position that is very viable for the 21st century. So that you may or may not agree with, but that's the kind of my approach to him. So that's the structure. Let's begin with the ambiguity of science. This is probably the most controversial issue, and most people can stop the conversation right here, because we're not going to agree on what science means and how it has been employed. And so I'll give you some approaches here, and just that you'll recognize that I'm aware of the complexity and the ambiguity. So science can be any inquiry that seeks to understand the laws that govern the physical world of nature, or natural world, however you want to put it. That's one way of looking at it. So that's a very broad way. And we can see, if you use that, then you have science in antiquity, you have science in the Middle Ages, but it's very different from what we consider science to be today. You can also grow broader and say that science is any branch of organized knowledge, either about the physical world, but not only about the physical world, also about the social world. So history is a science, sociology is a science, psychology is a science, as we understand that word today and those disciplines today. A third approach is actually more pertinent to our conversation here. Science is human knowledge, discovered through human reason, but it does not depend on divine revelation. So the relationship between the divine and the non-divine origins of science, that would be a major issue for Jewish theology, as we will see through the talk. If you're going toward the modern period, you can say that science is a much more narrowly defined, rational method of inquiry to generate accurate description of the observable world, but you have to do it in a particular way that is based on experiments, and the experiments have to be public, they have to be transparent, they have to be repeatable. That's a particular way of understanding what science is. Some historians of science and people in the field of science and technology studies, they look at science as a social practice, and it's in certain institutions. And that practice always tells you what is and what isn't rational, what is and what isn't science. So that's a different kind of approach to science. A lot of people do history of science, and science technology studies are here. And finally, you can look at science as a feature of the culture of modern secularity, or the culture of modern society, and it's predicated on the disenchantment of nature. That's, of course, a term coined by Weber. So that would be an issue too. And some people, especially in the Orthodox world, you see as we get to the end of the conversation, would be quite unhappy with the culture of modernity, and the attitude towards science will change over time. So all this is to say that we will never be able to agree, but I don't want to stop the conversation at the debate about what science is and what it's not. I think that's not going to lead us. That's why I take an historical approach, and I think that helps us to move forward. We can also see that theology is no less complicated, no less diverse and pluralistic, especially in the Jewish tradition. We have attempts to talk about God, who according to Judaism is in principle unknowable, or at least there's a problem. How can you say anything about God? So, but what is clear in Jewish theology, that it's based on a certain understanding of a relationship. We call it covenantal relationship, right, between God and the people of Israel. So Jewish theology has much to do with unpacking that relationship. The way that Jewish theology goes about it is inherently exegetical or hermeneutical. It's developed through scriptural reasoning. It's not so much propositional or systematic. And that, I think, is going to be very relevant to the conversation, as I will try to tell you in this lecture. This is an interpretive process. I think it's a uniquely open-ended process. So in the same text, sometimes the same thinker, sometimes the same group of people that presumably share a lot in common, in fact, are going to hold very different views about God, about the relationship between God and Israel, God and the world. So there's something profoundly non-systematic, I think, about Jewish theology. Another feature is that Jewish theology is embedded in certain rituals and practices. So you can't really talk about theory. It's not just about beliefs. It's also about what people do. So it's a way of life. And that means that you cannot take this way of life from a particular kind of education. So Jewish theology is always, because it has framed Jewish collective identity as well as individual identity, education is the means to do it. And therefore, we're going to have constant debates about what is appropriate or permissible and what's not permissible, because what's at stake is the boundaries of Jewish society and of Jewish culture. So the question for us is to kind of figure out, does science-engaged theology enhance or diminish the Jewish way of life? And of course, Jews were debating that very issue. The people that I will speak about, most of them will be arguing that it enhances Jewish collective identity, but other people, of course, are going to say exactly the opposite. So again, that's another argument why I think it's very useful to think about it in terms of history, rather than in terms of propositional statements about what theology is or isn't, or what it says or doesn't say. So maybe we can say, well, there are terms that are unique to the Jewish discourse, and that's Torah and Chokhmah. I should have put Chokhmah here in the main term. But here we have, already in Deuteronomy, we have the notion that the Torah revealed is a particular wisdom, or is wisdom revealed uniquely to the Jewish people. And you can say that if you're going to do Jewish theology, you have to figure out the relationship between Torah and Chokhmah. But what is Torah and what is Chokhmah, and how do they relate to each other? That's also open to endless interpretation. So I'll just give you some example. You can say that only Torah counts because it contains divinely revealed knowledge, and therefore you don't need to engage non-revealed knowledge or discovered knowledge by human reason. That's a position that some people hold today, but not so much the people that I will focus on. Or you can say that human knowledge is necessary, it's instrumental, but it's of lower epistemic level. You can say that, but you can look at discovered knowledge, something that helps you to understand the divinely revealed world. That's a position, for example, Samson Raphael Hirsch and the people in modern Orthodoxy, I think, basically hold this position. Or you can say human knowledge is necessary for the correct interpretation of the Torah. That would be the position that Maimonides holds or held. And also the second one here, that you can say when you have apparent contradictions, they're only apparent, they're not real. What you need is to interpret science correctly and the Torah correctly, and then you resolve those contradictions. Or you can figure out that, and that's again, all the people who follow Maimonides would hold that cultivation of human knowledge is necessary for proper religious worship. So you cannot be a good Jew, so to speak, without knowing the sciences. And you can hold in a Another version of it is the cultivation of human knowledge is necessary for proper functioning in non-Jewish society, what we today would call in secular society. So all of these positions and all sorts of other variations were evident in the Jewish historical experience. And therefore, again, I really highly recommend that we take the historical approach rather than try to say, well, X is wrong and Y is right. So a quick disclaimer, because I cover a lot of territory here and a huge span of time, it's going to be necessarily superficial. I only try to offer a certain framework. I'll direct you to certain texts which are very useful. Every statement, every slide can be a foundation for other developments, whether it's another lecture, another book, another, and whatever it is, another essay. Of course, these are all very, we are speaking here in Rashi Prakim, we are speaking here in chapter headings. So the lecture is organized chronologically. I'm now in the second part of my talk. I'll start by going to Philo of Alexandria, who I think we can really we can start the story here, because I think that in many ways, I'm not the first one to say it, of course, Harry Wolfson said it many years ago, already in the 40s, that with Philo we begin the discourse that I will consider as science-engaged theology. So what's interesting about the Philonic approach, and I highly recommend that you become familiar with this book by Mara Niehoff. She's at the Hebrew University. It's a wonderful intellectual biography, it came up in 2018. It's a wonderful summary of a lot of work, but also her novel interpretation. And her novel interpretation is to differentiate between the early Philo, which is basically a Platonic position. He kind of reinterprets or tries to look at the biblical text through the prism of Platonic philosophy, and that's the originality of Philo. But what happens to him is that when he goes to Rome as the head of the Jewish delegation, he shifts from Platonism to Stoicism and develops a new position, or more sophisticated position. Some of it has to do just with rhetorical positioning, how he has to position himself to the Roman aristocracy. But I think if we look at the position that I summarized for you, the second at the bottom half of the screen, you'll see a new view that I don't believe we had before in the Jewish tradition. According to this view, and it was elaborated by Hindi Naiman in this book, on seconding Sinai. And here, the point here is that the Torah of Moses is a written copy of the laws of nature. So if that's the case, what is nature? Nature is that intelligible order that God imprinted. There's I won't get into the Hebrew words here, but there's an interesting connection, an interesting etymology here. But God imprinted into the world at creation. Therefore, what we need to do is to actually interpret nature as we interpret Torah and vice versa. So Torah and nature are really two sides of the same coin. So according to Philo, there is no conflict, cannot be a conflict between Judaism and Greek culture, including philosophy and science. What you need to do is to engage in the study of science as well as in the study of nature, and both of them are interpretive processes, and that's what he does in his wonderful commentaries. And then to engage in science and the study of nature is a religious activity. I basically think that this kind of position is what we're going to find throughout the tradition that I call science-engaged theology. In some ways, as Harry Wolfson already suggested, all of Jewish philosophy is science-engaged theology following a Philonic position, even though what is science and how to interpret the biblical text changes, but the orientation is the same. Now, it gets complicated because Philo did not become normative Judaism. The rabbinic position became normative Judaism, and we go to rabbinic text. Here, the story is more complex because you find some attempt to minimize or to restrict what Jews can and cannot teach, what Jews should and shouldn't know. So do not teach Greek wisdom to your children. That position is very complicated to figure out what is Greek wisdom. So is it just logic? Is it just rhetoric? Some people, like Dov Schwartz, for example, think that it's only about logic and rhetoric, or perhaps it's related to other things such as physics and metaphysics. When we get to Maimonides, you're going to see that Maimonides is going to argue that physics and metaphysics are indeed what Jews need to know, and for him it's physics and metaphysics taught by Aristotle as interpreted through the prism of Islamic philosophy. So I'm only leaving you with a question mark here, but what we do see in rabbinic text is attempts to tell what can and cannot be taught and how it should be taught. We have two bodies of literature, Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkavah, the account of creation and the account of chariot. What exactly that means is also up for debate. But I think that what you have is a certain reticence of engaging in natural knowledge or in inquiries about the natural world, especially if it's done by non-rabbinic people. So this is complicated. We can probably talk more about it later, but I kind of take the position of Jacob Neusner, who suggested that what the rabbis are interested in is not the natural world, but rather creating a certain way of life that can create a holy nation. And the holy nation is not done by science, but rather it's done by interpretation of the various commandments that Jews have to follow. Now, the story is complicated because we also have engagements in various inquiries that are non-rabbinic. So rabbinic Judaism does not express everything that ancient Judaism generated. So I broke it down to three kind of elements, or three kind of, if you wish, it's not just an approach, it's really a body of text. So the Enochian literature, or the Enoch cycle, the Sefer Yetzirah and its cognate literature, and the Jewish magical literature, these are bodies of inquiries done by Jews, but not necessarily rabbinic Jews. And definitely in the Enochian tradition, we don't know who created it, right? It's anonymous Jews, but definitely Jews. But that definitely you'll find a lot more interest in the natural world there. Is it science? Well, it's not modern science, but it's definitely some kind of science. For our discussion, this literature of Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, or also translated as the book of formation, that is the most relevant part of the story, because here we're going to find a certain, I call it an atomic model of the cosmos. It's an attempt. It's a linguistic model of the cosmos. The idea is that God created, then the world came. God spoke, and the world came into being, which means that Hebrew language is the matrix of creation, and that the Hebrew letters are these atomic elements of the created world. That idea would become very important in Kabbalah, which is a medieval development, but originated already in antiquity. So we'll come back to that. But again, if you think that if you only believe that science is what modern scientists believe it is, well, that's not science. But I think for an historian of science, that's very relevant. Same is true about the Jewish magical literature that people like Gideon Bohak in Tel Aviv University, that's what his research is about. And it's very much relevant. Those ritual instructions, prayers, incantations, recipes, that's kind of part of the story of ancient science. Well, the story changes radically in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, we do have the kind of the beginning of systematic study of science. Science now means Aristotelian science, or science as understood by the Aristotelian tradition. It's important to keep in mind that science is not separated from philosophy, and that theology was understood as the queen of the sciences. So what you have here is a whole new exposure to Jews, beginning primarily from the 9th century on, in which Jews encounter science which is available, Greco-Arabic science, which is available to them. Jews, if it's not totally clear, Jews now speak and read Arabic. They translate that body of literature. It's very significant. They translate it into Hebrew. They comment on it. They study it. But all this work on science is done in a private manner. It's not part of the curriculum of the Jewish yeshivot, of the Jewish academies of higher learning, but individual students of science, individual scientists, if you want to call them, or scientist philosophers, they can enjoy patronage from non-Jews. So that story of the Middle Ages is really crucial to what we make of the Jewish involvement in science. It's definitely flourishing in the Middle Ages. Our famous example, or the person who is most relevant to the story, of course, is Maimonides. I'm not saying anything new here, but what's problematic about Maimonides is that he created what I would call a puzzle that really requires Jews to engage in both science and Torah interpretation. I'll just move just briefly to this screen. Everybody, of course, is familiar with the God of the Perplexed, which is probably the most perplexing book. This is what it looked in the Judeo-Arabic. The problem with Maimonides is that he's arguing that the inner, hidden, esoteric meaning of the Torah is identical with science, but only science to the extent that science is correct. So he allows, I go back to the previous here, he's able to tell, well, this element of Aristotelian position is right, this element is not right, so I'm going to take Aristotle only to the extent that I judge that Aristotle is correct. So what we have here is a very interesting position that really invites every Jew, almost not just invite, but expects every Jew to become a scientist philosopher, a person who can really interpret the biblical text correctly, as Maimonides believes is the correct position. And the position that he left for posterity is written in particular way. I won't get into the technicality of it, but in a very particular and perplexing and unique way. And my position is that he did it intentionally in order to force Jews to engage in science and philosophy together with a reading of the biblical text. So the book at the bottom is it's a new interpretation by Micah Goodman. Maimonides, God of the Perplexed, is the book that changed Judaism. Basically, it's about the secrets of the God of the Perplexed. And it's a very easy to read book, a very accessible book. But I want to suggest to you that everybody today, among historians of Jewish philosophy and among theologians, I would say that if you want to know what Jewish science-engaged theology looks like, do read the new books, all the books in the last, 50 years written about Maimonides. They're always doing science-engaged theology by explaining how Maimonides, what Maimonides meant, how much Aristotle was there, what he did or didn't do, and so forth. So what you, we'll come back to it. I'll refer to it again at the end, but this is a very important way of thinking about Jewish science-engaged theology. So Maimonides is complicated. After Maimonides developed his ideas, of course, his ideas generated a major controversy that lasted for at least for 2 centuries, 13, 14, and some even also through the 15th century. I'm not going to tell you much about the Maimonidean controversy, but I do want to suggest that there is a connection between the rise of Kabbalah at the end of the 13th century to function as an alternative to Maimonides. And by alternative to Maimonides or Maimonideanism, I basically mean alternative to Jewish Aristotelianism. So Kabbalah is saying, or the Kabbalists are saying, we're not buying the kind of fusion that Maimonides shared with us or insisted on understanding but rather there's something else that the hidden meaning of the Torah is about, and that something else is what Kabbalah is. Kabbalah is the body of knowledge that can be traced, of course, to antiquity. It was consolidated in the 12th century. It in two centers in Germany and in Provence, but it flourished in the 13th century in Spain. The major text is Sefer Zohar, the Book of Enlightenment. It's literally from a literary perspective, it's a fascinating, original, imaginative text. It is written as if a rabbi from the 2nd century wrote it, but it's not. It's actually written by a 13th century character, or at least edited by a 13th century person about whom we know quite a lot because we know his other writings. His name is Moshe de Leon, or Moses de Leon. The point is that the Kabbalah claims to know the inner meaning of the Torah, which is not what Aristotle told us. It has nothing to do with science. It's actually the right understanding of the Torah and the right understanding of what God is all about. Sefer Zohar was published in 2 editions. Those are the 2 editions that were published in the middle of the 16th century in Italy, and it became further, especially during the printing and toward the end of the 16th century, we have further development of how to interpret Sefer Zohar. It was developed by Isaac Luria and his disciple, hence we talk about Lurianic Kabbalah. We won't get into it, but it's the Lurianic version that very much influenced the history of Christian Kabbalah in the following centuries, 16th and especially 17th century. So if you ask me kind of very briefly, what's the novelty of Kabbalah? The novelty of Kabbalah is to look at God as a unity within plurality of forces. They call it Sfirot, in singular is Sphira. This is a very common, this is the common diagram of the deity or the Godhead as a unity of 10 Sfirot. All of this is very complicated, but the point here is that Kabbalah teaches you how to interpret the natural world as a text. So Kabbalah textualizes nature in a certain way. That's why that would be one way why I argue that Kabbalah, even though it was relevant to the history of modern science, the rise of modern science, it's not scientific. But Kabbalah understood itself as the science of divinity. It tells you exactly what you need to know about God. But of course, it's highly imaginative, totally linguistically based and narratively based, and fascinating story that should be another lecture. So I need to move on just to be sure I cover what I need to cover in this story. So let me raise the issue of the relationship between Kabbalah and modern science. So if you're not familiar with Alison Coder's scholarship is very, very relevant here. Here are 2 books by her, The Impact of Kabbalah in the 17th Century, The Life and Thought of Francis Mercury van Helmont, and then her more recent book, Religion, Magic, and Science in Early Modern Europe and America. There's no doubt that we cannot understand early modern Europe without the story of Kabbalah and its impact and influence on non-Jews, but how to interpret it, it's beyond the scope of this lecture. Some people I see in the audience, I believe, know quite a lot about it and can tell us more. But I do want to bring to your attention not just her, but also the work of Matt Goldish, who showed the importance of Kabbalah to the interpretation of modern science, especially by looking at Newton. So we have many more studies that clearly, when we speak about modern science, Kabbalah, the rise of modern science, Kabbalah is part of the story. But how did it help or not help? That's a complicated question. In some ways, Kabbalah helped or is relevant to the rise of modern science, especially if you think about empowerment, the empowerment of the human, because magic and let alone theurgy is always the power of human to impact reality. But you can also say that Kabbalah is hampering the rise of modern science, or the Jewish involvement in the rise of modern science, rather, because it doesn't accept the some of the assumptions of modern science, especially the binary dichotomies between objective and subjective, the religion and the secular, or nature and culture. So you can say that in Kabbalah there is a non-modern or non-modernist position or attitude or outlook, but maybe in some ways, and I'm just teasing, Kabbalah is postmodern in some ways rather than modern. But anyway, we can talk about that. That's a very fascinating issue. What's clearly, when we move from the early modern period, things begin to change in a fundamental way. And David Ruderman is the most important scholar who argues that the story lies in the admission of the Jews to European universities started in the end of the 15th century, and the emergence of a new kind of Jewish intelligentsia that was very involved with the study of the sciences in a non-Jewish institution. And these are the people who were the kind of the bearers of the movement that we call Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, that is beginning to look at the value, not just instrumental value, but deep, important value, inherent value in science. And you cannot be part of the society that Jews want to be part of and not be involved or informed about science. So what happens now in the 18th century, and it will come to fruition, especially in the 19th century, is the process of secularization. Judaism became a religion, to use the way that Lior Batnitsky has put it. It's very, very useful to think about it. This is something new. Judaism was a way of life, not a religion, quote unquote. So this process of secularization is about privatization and separation between those domains of life. And I would argue that that's the insoluble dilemmas for Jews. All Jews in the modern period are going to struggle with that, how to make sense of it, and how to resolve something that maybe cannot be resolved. I'm not sure. But I want to suggest to you that there's interesting work, of course, by historians of science about how science contributed to the secularization of Jews in the modern period. So this is an older book by David Hollinger that talks about primarily American Jews, but I think this is, if you're only familiar with one book, I highly recommend Noah Ephron's book, in which he tells the story of science as a secularizing force in America, in the land of Israel, namely with modern Zionism, and in Russia. So those are the three major chapters, and each one deserves, it can be developed into a new book. But clearly many Jews flocked into the sciences because they saw in it a way for integration in the modern world that was not open to them without science. So how to resolve the dilemmas that secularization proposed to all Jews is an open-ended question. But I suggest to you that if we go here, that the three main approaches to modern Judaism offer different ways of integration of science and religion. So among Reform rabbis, you'll see one approach. Among what was originally known as the Positive Historical School or Conservative Judaism is another approach. And then the Neo-Orthodox or Modern Orthodoxy, that's a third approach. So either one will tell you a slightly different way of coping with this initial dilemma, and there are more ways of coping with it, but all of them are, open to interpretation. So I just want to suggest to you two names, and I see I'm conscious of the time. So Thea, if you can give me a few more minutes, I will try to put it all together toward the end. The key person here in the story is Samson Raphael Hirsch, the founder of Neo-Orthodoxy in Germany. Absolutely a fascinating figure, so fascinating that if you're interested in environmentalism today, I would highly recommend that you reread Samson Raphael Hirsch, because he had some fascinating things to tell us about the environment, the natural environment, and how Judaism and Jews need to protect and preserve the environment. So in some ways, he's our first Jewish environmental thinker. But the problem with, so he left for posterity this famous slogan, Torah derech eretz, Torah and worldly knowledge, or Torah and the secular sciences. It's translated different ways. But you can interpret it. Does it mean coexistence? Does it mean hierarchy? Does it mean synthesis? Does it mean fusion? How does it mean it? That's open to interpretation. However, his position will be developed primarily or put into institutional setting by Yeshivah University. And I want to highlight the work of Norman Lamb. It's third president, but the first American-born president. So Norman Lamb is the person who promoted the Torah U-Madda project. The Torah U-Madda project, Torah and science, argue that you really need to be so very deeply involved in both of those bodies of literature. And the question for me, he wrote this book he wrote in 1990. And the question is why? Why did he need, about a century after Samson Raphael Hirsch, why does he have a need to make the case? And the answer has to do with post-secularism, that in the 80s and the 90s, there's a change in America, change all over the world about the place of religion in the public sphere. And that change also impacts Yeshivah University. When people are beginning to question this dual commitment to science and Torah, or to teaching both science and the traditional subjects. And Norman Lamb, who is both an ordained rabbi as well as a chemist by training, as well as a philosopher, he's arguing against the two sides, against those people on the right of him, let's call them the ultra-Orthodox, versus the people on the left of him, let's call them the postmodernist or the non-traditional position. I want to suggest to you, if you want to see understand the changes within modern Orthodoxy, to which those changes is what caused Rabbi Lamb to deal with it, I highly recommend the work of Rachel Pe'er from Bar-Ilan University, and her dissertation, and which came out in several essays that she published, show how Orthodox rabbis changed their views toward evolution, and she explains the process that caused that kind of change. That process is what I call the emergence of post-secularism that requires a different relationship between science and religion. And that leads me to the third part, the last part of my comments about Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who in a sense I present him as a post-secular thinker, as a person who is saying, I don't just want to do Torah and science in a simplistic way or in kind of an incomplete way as was done before him. He is seeking something else, and that something else is what I believe is the heart of what post-secularism is about. So he has many books, of course, but two books that are very relevant to his position is The Dignity of Difference, and the most recent book that was published just before his untimely death, Morality, Restoring the Common Good in Divided Times. So what he is basically trying to show is that if we emphasize the complementarity of science and religion, and if we have the knowledge of science that can explain why we need both science and religion, we are going to come to a much more balanced position, a more integrative position of those two domains. And he especially, I mean, it's really absolutely fascinating integration, which I think is very relevant. And we can talk more if you want to ask me more questions about why that is the case. But the argument is that in order to understand why why science and religion are both necessary, is you have to read his most recent book and his attention to brain science and neuroscience, cognitive sciences, and what they tell us about the structure of the human brain and how it's relevant. It's ultimately for him is relevant, believe it or not, to the interpretation of Torah. So here is this is his commentary, his Torah commentary on the Pentateuch. He has other books in that series, but basically he's telling us we need to go back to a rereading of the Hebrew Bible, not through the prism of Pauline theology, but through a particular understanding of the Jewish tradition. And that particular ways of interpreting the biblical text is what science-engaged theology is all about. So I summarize it for you here, kind of what it's all about. It's a hermeneutical approach. It's highly pluralistic. It's relational because it's all within the concept of the covenantal theology. It's all about ethics, and for him, it's virtue ethics that he develops. It has to do with education. It has to do with historical evolution. It has to do with being in the public sphere, not private. It's highly pragmatic. It deals with very concrete issues, especially issues including issues in England, including issues in Europe, in America, about the structure of the family, education, you name it, environment, technology, it's all relevant. And it's dialogical in the sense that it's interactive with non-Jewish literature, positions, philosophy, culture as a whole. So my last, if you want to find out where can you find contemporary Jewish science-based theology, I suggest you go to Jewish philosophy and you look at texts such as Norbert Samuelson's text, which I suggested in the beginning. Len Goodman's text is another example how contemporary Jews who do philosophy, Jewish philosophy, also deal with it. There are journals like the Journal of Torah U-Madda, which comes out of Yeshivah University, or Aleph, Historical Studies in Science and Judaism, or Journal of Jewish Ethics. That's an example of a very important sources for activities relevant to this. You can look at Templeton and its funding of various projects, including my own projects. There's an organization called Sinai and Synapses coming out of Klal, and led by Rabbi Geoffrey Middleman. That's an example. Their project is what scientists in synagogues. It's a very interesting project. Society of Jewish Ethics is relevant here. And finally, my project at ASU, Judaism, Science and Medicine Group, and the annual conference we do. So that kind of gives you a sense of where Jewish science-engaged theology is. And with that, I will say thank you to all of you, and I guess I can stop sharing my screen and then we can start the conversation.
Well, it's for me to give an initial word of thanks for what has been a very wide-ranging and stimulating account. And in fact, I'm sort of more or less overwhelmed because I think I've heard of a full course of Jewish intellectual history for the last 2,000 years. And thank you. I'm feeling very uncomfortable about having to bring the conversation to a close because we, in a way, we've just started. You have opened up, Hava, so many areas of interest and controversy in many places. So at very least, we must thank you for a wonderful talk and coverage, very wide coverage of Jewish intellectual issues in the field of science and religion. Thank you.
Thank you all.
We should all
and it's
wave our hands or something.
Continued. Pleasure to be with you. Bye-bye.